Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua, Messianic Synagogue, and here tonight. This is our regular Wednesday evening Torah study, and doing this from my home, as you can tell, and we're doing this as long as the COVID epidemic has us in lockdown. Of course, looking forward to that being reset real soon. Looking forward to that. So we'll get back to some semblance of normalcy just as soon as everything is in place. In the meantime, we're continuing to do these Torah teachings from my home, and just walking through the Torah portion each week, and so forth. So that's been a real delight, and I've gotten some feedback. By all means, if you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments, and would love to dialogue or discuss anything with you. If you want to subscribe to our channel, you will receive notifications whenever we post a teaching. We also post our Shabbat services online, and we will continue to do that even after things get back to normal. We're going to continue this online ministry as a service and a resource and a blessing to the kingdom of God. We've had some feedback that have indicated that it's just really important that we continue to do this. So we're going to. So those of you who have been following us and have joined our little community, then we welcome you, and you'll be able to continue to follow us as we go along. Okay, this week's Torah portion, we have concluded Leviticus, Vayikra, and we have begun the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, and this is the first portion from Bamidbar. This is the chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 20. Bamidbar means translated in the desert, and this is the beginning of the book of Numbers. However, last week we took a departure and looked at the narrative of the bitter waters from Exodus chapter 15 as a kind of statement to kind of current events, if you will, everything that's been going on in our culture, and just looking at that as a commentary on our times, and found a lot of good insight there. And so I would like to conclude that teaching a little bit more, like to explore that a little bit more in a little bit different direction here this evening. So while the Torah portion is, of course, Bamidbar, we are departing from that, and we're going to look again at this concept of healing. Last week, we took this departure, looked at the narrative of the bitter waters in Shemot, Exodus 15, the bitter waters called Mara in the text. And we explored the connections between the episode of the bitter waters and the evil of Pharaoh, casting all the boys into the Nile. We explored the connections between the Moses story as he was cast into the Nile while his sister Miriam stood by. Incidentally, Maryam means bitter waters or bitter sea or bad sea. We explored this idea that this is where the Torah names Adonai as our healer, the Raphaenu, that there was much healing that was required from their time in Egypt, that was begun in this expression of throwing the tree into the bitter waters and the waters becoming sweet. This week I want to extend this teaching a little bit more and kind of take it in a little bit different direction. So again, from Shemot chapter 15, Exodus chapter 15, it says, verse 25, he cried out to Adonai, and Adonai showed him a tree. When he threw it into the waters, they were made sweet, and there he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. And he said, if you diligently listen to the voice of Adonai your God and do what is right in his eyes, pay attention to his mitzvot and keep all his decrees, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I am Adonai who heals you. So we have this reference to healing, once again, and we have this reference to the diseases of the Egyptians. We could certainly discuss the diseases of the Egyptians. We touched on that previously. And then we've got this line here, I am Adonai who heals you. But we also have this that might have jumped out at you. It's a reference to his statutes and ordinances. In this translation, it's mitzvot, and it's his decrees, his statutes and his ordinances. So this is the epoch of their time between Pesach and Sinai. What statutes do we have during this period of the history of the people of Israel? There's been a number of profound epochs in the timeline of history of mankind. These are unusual times, but we have one here between the departure from Egypt and the arrival at Horeb at Sinai. And we have this reference here during that period of time. The episode of the bitter waters occurs between Passover and Sinai, between Pesach and Sinai. What statutes did we have at this time? What is Adonai talking about when he says, there he made a statute and ordinance from them, he tested them, as you diligently listen to the voice of Adonai your God, do what is right in his eyes, pay attention to his mitzvot, and keep all his decrees. I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put upon the Egyptians, for I am Adonai who heals you. It's almost like there's a connection between healing to these mitzvot, to these decrees, statutes, and ordinances, but between the healing and the statutes. But what are the statutes? Okay, let's talk through this. Remember, at the time of the arrival in the valley, the Sinai waste, the wasteland at the base of the mountain of Mount Horeb, when they arrived there, we have this interesting narrative, a blast from the past for Moshe. His father-in-law arrives on the scene, Yitro, and Yitro is bringing his daughter, who is Moshe's wife, and for a reunion, bringing his daughter to him. And it says in Shemot, Exodus chapter 18, the next day Moses sat to judge the people, and they stood around Moses from morning until evening. When Moses, his father-in-law, saw all that he did for the people, he said, what's this you're doing to the people? Why sit by yourself alone with all the people standing around you from morning until evening? Moses answers his father-in-law, it's because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have an issue, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and a neighbor, so I make them understand God's statutes and his laws. Again, this is that period between prior to Sinai, after the Exodus, after leaving Egypt. What statutes and laws? Now, some have conjecturized that perhaps what's referred to here is the law of God. There were certainly rules and thoughts about sacrifices, rules and statutes regarding days. The Shabbat was probably known at this time. These days and these ordinances and these rules and regulations were probably known. There was some of the truth of God that was likely known to people, especially the people of God. That's a possibility of what's being referred to here. But if we look at the text, there are actually a few laws and statutes in this epoch of history, in this little moment of history between Pesach and Sinai. One of those is the laws around Pesach. Actually, there are laws around Passover that do continue and follow them into this period of time. First of all, you're to sacrifice the lamb. You're to bring the lamb into your homes. You are to eat matzah for 7 days, unleavened bread. You are to keep the date. And then we have these, a selection of laws regarding the foreigner. In Shemot, Exodus chapter 12:48, says this, if an outsider dwells with you who would keep the Passover for Adonai, all his males must be circumcised. Then let him draw near and keep it. He will be like one who is native to the land, but no uncircumcised person may eat from it. The same Torah applies to the native as well as the outsider among you. with that one stroke, just a parenthetical statement here, with that one stroke, we have one Torah, one law, one set of commandments that applies to the foreigner who dwells among the people of Israel. So that's something that has to be taken in context when you discuss do Gentiles keep Torah, or can Gentiles choose to keep Torah, or can Gentiles graft themselves into Israel, and so on and so forth. So that's a good discussion. But here it seems to indicate quite emphatically, unequivocally, there is one Torah that applies to the native as well as the outsider who dwells among you. So it says here that the foreigner may not eat of it, but the one who dwells with you may eat of it. The foreigner is somebody who might be passing through. He might be a servant. He might be a slave. He might be an immigrant for labor, for work. He is not dwelling with you. He hasn't taken up residence beyond that of his work or employment or temporary passage. The foreigner may not eat of it. Somebody who hasn't grafted themselves into the people of Israel is not to eat of the Passover for this reason. But the one who dwells with you, the one who has grafted himself in, the one who has made himself, ingratiated himself and become one with the people of Israel, he is to participate. You are to include him. He is to be included. It says, let him draw near and keep it. It's an emphatic commandment based on the initiative of the foreigner, of the ger, of the Gentile. It says, let him draw near and keep it. When a young man takes a fancy to a young woman, let him go and approach the family. Let him do this. And it says he'll be like one who is native to the land. It's this idea of the people coming in and wanting to be one with Israel, and there is a sense of hospitality, there's a sense of adoption, there's a sense of acceptance, absolute acceptance at this time in what's being presented here. Okay, so that is something that is being discussed. That is a statute. These are a set of statutes and laws and regulations that are being discussed here at this time. Again, we're looking for statutes and regulations that would help us understand what is meant by this comment of these are the statutes that are to be kept in this context with healing, in this sort of connection with healing. Okay, other commandments, other statutes, other laws. We have the laws of setting aside the firstborn. We have laws of manna. These are laws and regulations and statutes that have been implemented and communicated to the people of Israel in this sort of moment in history between the Exodus, departing of Egypt, and coming into the land, coming into the covenant with Adonai at Mount Horeb. The other set of laws that we have is the laws of manna. The person who gathers manna has some laws that apply to this. But these laws don't just apply to the person, they apply to everyone who is gathered in that person's tent. Consider Shemot, Exodus 12, verse 37. Bnei Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot as well as children. Next line, also a mixed multitude went up with them, along with the flocks, herds, and heavy livestock. Now, parenthetically or incidentally, let's also notice verse 42. Now the time that Bnei Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. So it happened at the end of 430 years, to the very day that all the armies of Adonai went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching for Adonai to bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night is a night of vigil for Adonai for all Bnei Israel throughout their generations. Okay, so the laws of manna were this. The laws of manna applied to the manna that came down out of heaven, that covered the ground in the morning. And it was like a fine seed, like a coriander seed. It could be ground up and made into many different grain type products, breads and cereals and these kinds of things. It was a form of, it resembled grain in that respect. You can do everything with grain, from make tortillas to pancakes, to breads, to biscuits, and everything in between, depending on how you mix some other ingredients with it. So you would have this manna that would cover the ground. In the text it says it's like coriander seed. And you would go out and you would gather it in the morning. When the sun came out and came high in the sky, then it would be so that it would be so that it would melt, and you would lose your chance to gather manna for that day. So you would go out in the morning to gather this. It would be on the ground with the dew, and you would brush it off into a pot. You were to gather one day's portion when you went out to gather. You were to gather one day's portion for every person in your tent, or every person in your household. So whoever went out to gather, their responsibility was to gather for everyone in their household. So if you and your son go out to gather, you're responsible to gather enough for everybody in the household. And if you would do that based on these portions. You're to gather one day's portion. Now, if you gathered too much in your pot and you went back to your tent, by the time you got back to your tent, if you had gathered too much, it was miraculously reduced to the proper amount. And in the text it says, if you gathered too little, by the time you got back to your tent, it was miraculously increased to the proper amount. All right, so the first law of the manna is you are to go out and you are to gather a day's portion. All right. You are not to keep any of the manna until the following day. So if you kept any of the manna the following day, you would transgress the law of God. And when you inadvertently or even intentionally did happen to keep manna to the following day, when you got up the next morning, it had become rotten and it had worms. So you'd have to throw it out. You weren't going to eat it anyway. All right, so that's the second law of manna, was this idea that you would have to consume the manna, eat the manna during the day that you gathered it. However, on Friday, you were instructed to gather 2 portions of manna, and you would take these 2 portions of manna, and one of them would be for the portion for Friday, and the other would be the portion for Shabbat, for the Saturday, for the next day, for the Shabbat. You were not to go out and gather anything on the Shabbat. You were to gather 2 portions per person in your household, including everyone in their tent, and you would do that on Friday. You do double portion for everyone in their tent. If you went out of your tent on Shabbat, on Saturday morning, to go and look for manna, you would find there was no manna. Even if you intended to go out of your tent and look for manna, there was none to be had. All right, so we've got these, kind of generalizing them down, we've got these 3 main laws of manna. You were to gather one day's portion, you were to eat the one day's portion in the day that you gather it, and you were to gather a double portion on Friday, and that double portion would be one for Friday and one for Shabbat, for Saturday. Those are the primary kind of categories of the laws. Now consider this. Hypothetically, I'm going to transgress. I'm getting greedy, and I decide to go out of my door, and I'm going to gather extra. What happens when I get back to my tent? I've filled up 2 pots instead of 1. I've filled up double portions or triple portions instead of 1. What happens when I get back to my tent? I look down, and miraculously, the manna has reduced to 1 portion for every person in my tent. What if I inadvertently or accidentally gathered too much? When I get back to my tent, the manna has reduced to the proper amount. What if I go out my door and I'm lazy and I'm shiftless, and I decide, I'm not sure that I really want to gather this today, and I go here and I go there? What if I get up a little bit late and I don't have time to get enough? Or what if all the tents around me seem to have gathered up a bunch of the easy stuff, and I have to walk farther to get some, and by the time I walk farther, it seems to have melted, as the text says. So I don't get enough on that day. Again, I've transgressed the law of manna. I didn't gather a day's portion, but when I get back to my tent, what do I have? I have a day's portion. It has miraculously increased to the proper amount. Likewise, let's say on Shabbat, on Saturday morning, I get up and I'm going to transgress the law of God, and I'm going to go outside. I'm going to gather manna, and I walk out of my tent, and what do I see? There's no manna anywhere. There's nothing to do. Now, here's the point that I make of it, is that the laws of manna are very restrictive in the sense that you could not transgress them if you wanted to. So it's like this. It's Adonai gives us a law, a mitzvot, a commandment, in the form of the commandments of the manna, and yet there's no possible way to transgress these commandments. There's no way we could get around this. There's nothing else we could do around this. My oldest daughters are 19. My youngest is just turned 6. And so, I remember raising these kids, and there's a moment where you tell a child, as you approach the street, look both ways before crossing the street. But what else do? You don't just say look both ways before crossing the street. You hold their hand, because you're not going to allow them to transgress. What is it that you're saying to them by saying look both ways before crossing the street? You're teaching them. You're teaching them not to run into a street, but you're also teaching them obedience, because they are going to learn obedience and learn the benefits of obedience by this instruction you've given them, but by the guarantee that you have that they're going to follow your instruction. Another example of this might be the electrical outlets in your house. It would be a transgression for a child to stick their fingers in an electrical socket. Well, what do we do for our very, very young children, our rugrats, our carpet pals, the kids who are crawling around on the floors? We put outlet protectors in the outlets of our homes because we don't want them to make a mistake. We prevent them from making transgressions. We may tell a child, don't touch that, but we also watch them to make sure they don't touch that. And even if they reach out to touch something, we'll take them and redirect them. We'll move the object or something like this. We may say, don't touch that, but we're also monitoring the process in order to make sure that they obey. What is it that's happening psychologically when we do this with our children? We're not only teaching them the things that they can touch and not touch, but we're also teaching them obedience and faithfulness. We're teaching them what it means to obey. But one of the greater things that we're teaching them, one of the meta principles that we're teaching them, is we're teaching them trust. So, again, we mentioned this verse about Adonai watching over the people of Israel. I said in Shemot, Exodus chapter 12, the time that Bnei Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. This same night is a night of vigil for Adonai, for all Bnei Israel throughout their generations. What is that verse talking about? For me, one of the things that verse is talking about is what I just said, that Passover is the birth of the nation. And what do you do when a nation is first born? What do you do when a child is first born? You watch over them. You keep vigil over them. And while we grow and we mature and we came into the covenant, and then later we came into the land, and we grow throughout all these things, we are still under the watchfulness of this vigil. And as a memorial to this watchfulness and the vigil that began, it says that Adonai keeps the same night as a vigil for Bnei Israel. We began with these laws and statutes at the episode of Marah, the bitter waters. Notice one of the common threads running through these sort of commandments is the commandment of the stranger, the alien among you, the mixed multitude. It was the mixed multitude of the people at the Pesach, at the Passover. It was the mixed multitude who came with Israel out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt. and it's the persons in your tent. The understanding that some of this mixed multitude would have lived with some of the people of Israel. It's the persons in your household, and out, etc. And over again, Adonai says this: I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The thread here is that you are to remember your time in Egypt as a slave, and you are to treat foreigners with love and with kindness, with adoption and with favor, if they are willing to dwell with you and become one of your people. In Shemot, Exodus 20, the 10 sayings or the 10 commandments begins with, or ends with, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am Adonai your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Leviticus 22, just before the Moedim, the appointed times, the calendar, 22 verse 31. So you are to keep my mitzvot and do them. I am Adonai. You must not profane my holy name, for I may be made holy among Bnei Israel. I am Adonai who makes you holy, comma, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Adonai. He is weaving his personality, his character, his identity into this this understanding of deliverance and freedom from the bondage of Egypt. We see a lot of references to the mitzvot somehow being related to their time as strangers and aliens and slaves in Mitzrayim and Egypt. One of the characteristics of their time in Egypt, of the people of Israel, one of the characteristics of their time in Egypt was that they were provided food. They were provided food likely in exchange for their labor. They ate the food that was provided for them. There is something unholy about taking food from an enemy, or even just an enemy of Adonai, perhaps not a personal enemy, but perhaps just an enemy of Adonai. Do you want to consider who your enemies are? Just consider who are enemies of Adonai, because the enemies of Adonai are the enemies of us. But the people of Israel accepted food from Pharaoh. It was an unholy bargain. They made a deal with the devil. They sold their soul, in effect. Yet it was complicated. They were kind of stuck. They were slaves. You had to do all this work, and you were treated terribly, but your food was given to you. The same Pharaoh who threw your boys into the Nile is providing you with food. Now think of the psychological twist. It's a real mind twist to consider living under that system. That on the one hand, I'm a slave and I'm being treated terribly, horribly, even to the point that you're taking my children and throwing them into the Nile. But then you give me food. It was the food of slavery and bondage. It kept you alive, and you thrived under it, sort of. According to the tellings, the references, we have all sorts of foods that they remembered quite fondly. When they complained about the manna, they would mention, the wonderful things that they ate back in Egypt. And on the one hand, maybe they were just complaining and being overdramatic, but on the other hand, it sounds like they had some variety to their diet. It sounds like they had good food. And this is the real, and I'm sorry I'm not communicating this well, but it is this almost unholy and evil place that you get to, when you're taking a handout from your enemy, when you're in a place where you're accepting welfare from somebody who does not have your best interests, somebody who's evil, and yet by the system, they're providing you with your daily bread. They're keeping you alive. They are sustaining you. So they complained about the manna and how there was no meat. The first reference we have to this is the episode of the quail in Shemot, Exodus 16, which is right at the beginning of receiving the manna. We see it again in Bamidbar, Numbers, chapter 11. And it says this in chapter 11, "Now a wind went out from Adonai and drove quails from the sea. He brought them into the camp about a day's journey in any direction, about 2 cubits above the ground, all around the camp. The people went out all night and all the following day and collected quail. No one gathered less than 10 omers. They spread them out all around the camp." Notice the omer is the daily portion of manna. No one gathered less than 10 omers in one day. They went out all night, it says. They went out quail hunting all night. It says the quail were about 2 cubits, about 3 feet above the ground. The commentators are that what that's speaking of is that the quail were tired and they wouldn't fly high or very fast. They could only fly a few feet off the ground for short distances, and so people were able to catch them, and they went out all day and collected quail. While the meat was between their teeth, the text says, before it was swallowed, Adonai's anger burned against the people, so Adonai struck the people with a severe plague. Some authors have conjectured about the headdresses of the kings of Egypt. We have this, to this day, images and pictures of these headdresses of the Egyptian pharaohs and kings, many of which include a tiny bird statue at the crown of the head that resembles the quail. So the question is, was Adonai responding directly to the emotional entanglement the people had with Pharaoh as their benevolent food source? In other words, people were complaining about the manna. They wanted the quail, they wanted the meat, they wanted the food from Egypt. The food from Egypt wasn't just good food from Egypt because Egypt was the breadbasket of the Middle East of that day. No, the food of Egypt was at the hand of Pharaoh. It was an evil entanglement on their soul. They were in bondage and enslaved, not just by the bonds of chains and shackles and violence, but they were in bondage by the psychological effect of being given their food from the hand of Pharaoh. So the point of this, the people were still under the spell of Pharaoh. What is necessary to break this spell? What is necessary to break this entanglement from Egypt? And if you work with people who struggle with addictions, or people who struggle with compulsive behaviors, this line that the psychologists use, we do what we do because we get what we want. Everyone has to acknowledge at some point that there was an exchange, there was a transaction. I was getting something for my compulsive behavior. No matter how destructive, no matter how demeaning, there was something I was getting out of it. And so you have this guilt and shame that is resident and attendant in a person who's trying to get free from an addiction or from a compulsive, destructive behavior, with the acknowledgement that they were somehow a complicit partner in this, that it wasn't just a chemical addiction, it wasn't just a dependency, it wasn't something they fell into, but that there was a portion of it that was willful, that we do what we do because we get what we want. And we end up with these entanglements in our soul that are very difficult to break. This measure of guilt and shame at this point, of acknowledging that I put myself in compromising positions, or I made myself compromised, I made myself, allowed myself to be exploited in this way in exchange for food. What the point is that people were still entangled in this way, and what is so compelling about this food that came from Mitzrayim, from Egypt? Well, it was free. It came with, they didn't have to pay for it, apparently, other than their labors. It was good, apparently. The testimony is that it was good food, and it was available. One of the measures of civilization is how much time people spend on gathering and creating their food. But think of this again in terms of this unholy truce, this bargain of selling your freedom for a meal, of trading away your soul for food. And think of the damage and the injury to the soul that is done at this. Think of the damage and the injury to a person's heart when they deal with this sort of shame and this sort of guilt. And now we have the context, again, for another aspect of this statement by Adonai. When he says this, I am Adonai who heals you. Here's my point. Adonai needed to heal them of their emotional and spiritual dependence, of their entanglement with the Pharaoh. And the way that he did that is with the manna. It was a way of walking out the new dependency, the new freedom. It was a way of living in daily dependence upon Adonai. A victory over slavery and bondage beyond that of merely leaving Egypt. They were, one way you read the text, and it's almost as if they were thrown out of Egypt. Remember, it's as if they were thrown out by the Pharaoh after the plague of the firstborn. So when they left, you can understand that there would still be a slavery mindset that they would be working with. And what Adonai does is he establishes a daily dependence, and that daily dependence is the manna. The laws of the daily portion. You cannot break these laws even if you try. You cannot eat the food of Pharaoh even if you try. What does the text say? The text says that it got in their teeth before it was swallowed, and they were sick. You can't eat the food of Pharaoh. The only food that is available to you is the food of heaven. This is the healing, the daily portion, the daily bread, the manna. So during this time, during this epoch in history between Pesach and Shavuot, between Sukkot and Horeb, remember the Egyptian storehouse cities, Sukkot and Ramesses, these were our first two road marks as we departed Egypt. We came out of Egypt and we passed by the grain storehouses, the grain storehouse cities that we built for the Pharaoh, Sukkot and Ramses. And we passed them by on our way into the wilderness. And this was the last exit out of Egypt. This was the last road mark out of Egypt, the last image that you see, the last picture in your mind of the exile from Egypt is seeing these storehouse cities that you built for the Pharaoh. And then off you went into the wilderness being led by Adonai. Those were your first two road marks as you departed Egypt, but later we were to receive new road marks. The manna as a daily bread is a form of road mark as we mark the days until we receive the covenant at Horeb. It was a healing process, a healing time. Later we received a new way of memorializing this time of healing. It is the counting of the Omer. What is it that we're counting in the Omer? We're counting the days and the Shabbats until Shavuot. What is it that we count with the manna? It is the days and the Shabbats. We are on a marked journey, a marked course. This is our Omer, our daily portion, equivalent to the manna. The portion of the manna was called the Omer. We are remembering the healing of the manna, this daily nurturing, this daily healing by going through daily routine, this daily maintenance, where the memory of the Pharaoh and the food of the Pharaoh ceases to become a major fixture in your daily life, and it is the food of Adonai becoming the daily fixture of food and sustenance and nourishment in your days. For those of you who've come out of exploitive or slavery existences, yes, there's still slavery in the world even today. For those of you who are coming out of this, I don't work in that community, but I know that it's a work that is very difficult and very necessary to restore and to rebuild, to heal the psyche, to heal the injured soul of some of these victims. These victims' personalities need to be rebuilt, and the way that you do that is with routines and with very carefully controlled environments and carefully controlled exposures to life. And this is what Adonai was doing. He was healing the Israelites as they wandered along on this journey between Pesach and Sinai. As they wandered along this journey, he was healing them through this routine. And he says this, I am Adonai, God who heals you. And this journey from Pesach to Shavuot is marked with the counting of the Omer. And we're still counting the Omer, even today we count it, and it is part of our duty during this time. It is part of our statutes and mitzvot. We are remembering the healing of the manna as we go through this process, as we go through this, marking the time, the road marks of the days between the Pesach and Shavuot. What is it that we received on Pesach? We received deliverance, freedom. What is it we receive on Shavuot? It is adoption and covenant. You see, I'll use this as an illustration. It's a difficult illustration for those of you who work with these people, but we have a certain kind of slavery in our modern life, and it is a trafficking and an exploitive nature of young ladies that are trafficked and enslaved for evil purposes. And these young ladies are sometimes delivered, when they can be, from this kidnapping and trafficking. And as these young ladies are delivered, can you imagine? Say they're delivered on a Saturday, and you say, well, we know that you want to be married, and you want to be in a stable family, and you want a husband. So we've picked out a husband for you, and he's going to meet you on Sunday, and today's Friday, so you've got a couple days to get ready. That would just be unfair. That doesn't take into account or understand the depth of injury and the journey of healing, which must be accomplished, which must be concluded. In the same way, the journey from Pesach to Shavuot, from deliverance to covenant, from new birth to coming and meeting the husband as a bride, that is a journey that involves change, mostly involves healing. I am Adonai who heals you. This is what he says. And I believe that statement that Adonai said at the bitter waters, I am Adonai who heals you, I believe that's the theme, the central point, the pivotal point in this epoch from Pesach to Shavuot. I am Adonai who heals you. Okay, moving on. What is it that we're dealing with in our modern times? We're dealing with COVID. What has COVID taught us? Well, many of us, it has taught us that we can't depend on the government. It has taught us that we can't depend on the news media. We can't depend on hysteria. We can't depend on science. We can't depend on all these things. We have all these conflicting and contradictory positions and viewpoints, and there's people who are concerned about conspiracy theories and all the rest. And so this is what we have. We have a lack of trust. What has COVID left us with? It's left us with a crisis of trust. Who do we trust? Who can we trust in this? Shall I tell you what we're going to do? Do you trust me? My congregation trusts me to tell them when we're going to reopen, and we're processing that and walking through that process even now. But would I tell you that you can trust me? Do I know what's happening? We struggle with this. We struggle with this, and the net effect is fear. The truth of the matter is that nearly all of us are dealing with fear as a product of our experience with COVID. Fear is connected to guilt and shame. We are all tangled up in these trust sort of structures. We are tangled up in trusting science and trusting the government and trusting the CDC and trusting the White House and trusting the World Health Organization, in trusting the news to properly report the information. We're entrusting our governor, we're entrusting the state health department, our county leaders. We're trusting all these people, but at the same time we're afraid. We have a crisis of trust on our hands. Who do we trust? Who can we trust? It's all entangled, it's all broken, and we don't know who we can trust. Let me suggest to you that we are in this season of marking the days of this journey from Pesach to Shavuot, that we are counting the days of the Omer in this way. And as we do this, as we count the days of the Omer, and we see that Adonai is the one who is faithful, and we recall the days of the Omer in their terms of, in their connection to the healing that was offered to us through the provision of the manna and through the encounter at the bitter waters, the tree that was thrown into the bitter waters that brought healing. And this is what we have, is we have these memories and these connections that we remember as part of our processing of the counting of the Omer. So I'll say this: Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al safirat ha'omer. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 42 days, which is 6 weeks of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place, that is the house of the presence, speedily in our days. Amen. So we eagerly await the return of the presence of Adonai in the midst of us, in our midst. And where did we first come to know the real presence of Adonai? The real presence of Adonai was at Horeb, at Mount Sinai, where he came down and gave us the instructions through Moshe of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. We built the Mishkan, the tabernacle, we dedicated it, and on that day, the presence of Adonai took residence in the Mishkan, in the midst of us. And this is our desire, to see his presence in the midst of us, and we're eagerly awaiting that and eagerly looking forward to that. So I'll leave it with you. A blessing tonight. Please reach out to us if you have any questions or anything that you need. Thank you for spending this time, and just encourage you to keep marking the days and coming into greater knowledge of Adonai as a healer, and his restoration for you is bound to his love for you, and that he will not let you go, and he will not neglect, and he does bring us through to ultimate and complete healing. So may Adonai be with you this week. Shalom, shalom.